Hello friends, we have today Professor Santosh Mehrotra from JNU. He's a professor of economics. He has worked both internationally and domestically, both with the government. So we would like to know more about what has your life journey been like.
Well, I did my master's in economics in New York, and then I did a PhD from Cambridge University, and then I decided to come back to India. Obviously with the objective of becoming an academic, and I was an academic for about 6 years. I was in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I was associate professor there, teaching economics to economic development. And then I decided to go abroad. I'd come back after doing my PhD, but I decided to go back abroad because I got an offer from the United Nations system. So I led UNICEF's global research program, including at UNICEF Global Research Institute in Florence, in Italy, Innocenti Research Center, and then I moved back to New York to become chief economist of the Global Human Development Reports. I used to write the Human Development Report. After which I just decided to come back home, and I joined the government of India, joined the Planning Commission, where I headed up the Rural Development Division and then the Development Policy Division, and I was with the government from 2006 to 2014, which is 2014, quite right. And that was a period when the economy was growing really rapidly. It was a period of great optimism. So I have, in 2014, when I left government, I just went back to JNU as a professor. And so in other words, essentially I've had 3 careers over the course of my professional life. I've been an academic, I've been an international civil servant or technocrat advising governments, and then I've come back and joined my own government, and in our own government I was in the rank of Secretary to the Government of India. So I've had a good chance to be a policy maker, policy advisor, and a scholar of policy. And it's been all of these multiple influences, of course, have contributed to my understanding of our own country and our own economy. Because our economy and our country faces a very special challenge. We are at a very critical conjuncture in the life of our country. We keep hearing the term demographic dividend. India has been in the period of its demographic dividend. The dividend comes but once in the life of a nation. All nations experience it. The real issue is some countries manage to ride the wave and take advantage of the dividend, and others do not. And basically it means that in the early 1980s, the share of the working age population in our country began to rise, and the share of the dependent population began to fall. And if the working age population rises, and if the working age population actually get jobs, then the economy can continue to maintain a certain growth rate, which it must, because as number of young people join the labor force, they must get jobs, non-agricultural jobs. It's very important. They must not be agricultural jobs. Why they must get non-agricultural jobs? Because the meaning of development is structural transformation away from agriculture towards industry and then services. So our demographic dividend, which has been around for the last 40 years, will be around only for 20 more years. In 2040, we will run out of our dividend. China has already finished with its dividend. China has already become an aging society. The East Asian, all the rich countries have become aging societies. But the Chinese leaders are saying that we have become old without becoming rich. At least Europe became old after they became rich. So it's absolutely critical that India becomes rich before, and most Indians become rich and come out of poverty above all, before we become old. Because being old and poor and then remaining poor for the rest of one's life, and is going to be deeply damaging for the people of this country and for future generations.
Yeah, we see that China, or whether it be Japan, they have taken the advantage of the demographic dividend, and the economic has grown twofolds. So, in this current scenario of India, how do you see the economic trend? Is there a slowdown?
There is definitely a slowdown. The slowdown has become serious in the last 2 years. The growth rate of the economy in the last 5 years has been slower than the growth rate of the economy was between 2003-4 and 2013-14. And the growth slowdown has come at a time when the number of entrants into the labor force is increasing very rapidly. The number of young who have all gotten better educated, they're entering the labor force looking for work but not finding work, which is the reason why unemployment rate has risen. So in the last 5 or 6 years, unfortunately, we are seeing the opposite of what we should be doing in order to reap the advantages of a demographic dividend, because between 2000 and 2012 at least we were adding 7.5 million new non-agricultural jobs every year. That number has dropped to 2.9 million, less than 3 million per annum, at a time when the number of entrants into the labor force has increased. So this is very tragic for the young. And what is very important to note is that as we move forward, between 2020 and 2030, the number of entrants into the labor force who are all better educated is going to increase at an increasing pace. So if currently today, maybe 5 million are joining the labor force, that number will grow and grow and grow to become 12 million or so by 2030. And we have to provide jobs for them. In addition, we have to pull workers out of agriculture. We have to pull workers out of agriculture because the answer to the problems of agriculture lie outside agriculture, because 44% of our workforce is in agriculture, but they produce only 14% of GDP, and therefore people have to be pulled out of agriculture. So we have to provide work for new entrants, we have to provide work for those who need to and want to leave agriculture, and plus thirdly we have to provide jobs for the girls, the young girls particularly, who are getting better educated, and their aspiration is that they will get jobs in industry and in services, and they don't want to marry early, unlike the mothers.
Okay. So you say that economic is structural in nature rather than
slowdown.
Yeah, the slowdown is structural in nature rather than cyclic. What do you mean by that?
The government is of the view that the economy is in a cyclical slowdown. You see, economists believe all over the world that all economies, market economies, go through a upward cycle and then a downward cycle. That's called a business cycle. So in other words, that's why this slowdown is being called in that context by the government a cyclical slowdown. So we are in a downturn and we will not naturally and automatically go back up. However, the problem is that in the last several years, the economy is facing many constraints which are of a structural nature, which cannot be addressed by actions which are normally taken to get out of a cyclical crisis. So the actions that are normally taken to get out of a cyclical crisis tend to be confined to monetary policy and then fiscal policy. So monetary policy essentially involves reducing interest rates. In other words, reducing the repo rate. But the RBI has been reducing the repo rate, but despite the reduction in the repo rate, the investment rate has not risen. So monetary policy is clearly not working. Secondly, fiscal policy is another instrument that is used to pull, to take counter-cyclical action. What would be counter-cyclical action in the fiscal policy space? It means increasing public expenditure and reducing tax rates. So unfortunately, even though personal income tax rates have been reduced, corporate tax rates have been reduced, all that has happened is that government revenue has fallen, but private savings has not risen. If anything, private savings have gone down. And public expenditure, government has tried to increase, but its capacity to increase expenditure is low because tax revenues have actually not been increasing. Tax revenue to GDP ratio is actually pretty much flat. And when the economy is slowing, then over that period, what happens is that even the absolute value of revenue, even the tax to GDP is not rising, of course, but the absolute value of tax revenues also don't increase. So the capacity of the state to spend more is quite constrained. So, this kind of what you call counter-cyclical action on the monetary policy and fiscal policy side is not possible. But what we see, the reason why it's a structural crisis, I call it a structural crisis, is fourfold, because the four engines of the economy that drive growth are all sputtering. One engine is exports. Now, export growth was happening every year from 1991 to 2013-14, as a result of which, export to GDP actually rose from 11% in 1991 to 25% of GDP. And we peaked at 25% of GDP in the year 13-14, and that was similar to the sort of relationship between exports and GDP you find in China. So exports have actually, after 13-14, they've actually fallen from $315 billion, which is the level in 13-14. They've fallen very sharply, and they fell every year, in fact, all the way down to $265 billion, and they've risen back up slightly above the level of 13-14 only in the previous financial year of 18-19. So in other words, exports as a proportion of GDP has fallen from 25% to 17%. Okay. This is a real problem. Problem number one. This is one engine of growth. The second engine of growth is investment, and investment is a proportion of GDP which was about 23% in the year 2003, had shot up to 38% of GDP by the year 2007-8, and after that it did begin to fall as a result of the global economic crisis. But despite the fall, it was still at about 30 to 33% in 13-14. It is today at 28-29% of GDP. In other words, we are now down to a level of investment to GDP which was prevailing in the early 2000s, about 15 years ago, which is, private investment is a most important factor which drives growth, and that's the second factor, which is second determinant or driver that is sputtering. The third determinant is consumption. Now, private consumption has been relatively stable in our economy. It has been stable only because people are dissaving. In other words, you see what has happened. I was saying that unemployment rates had risen. When unemployment rises and non-agri jobs are not growing, then wages also don't increase. So between 2012 and 2018, we know that real wages remain flat. Between 2004 and 2012, actually, real wages had been increasing, as a result of which the country managed to reduce the absolute number of poor for the first time in the history of the country by 140 million over a 7-year period. But after 2012, because non-agri jobs were not growing, real wages were not increasing, therefore consumption has not been increasing. And if anything, people are maintaining consumption by actually saving less. So what has happened is that savings as a proportion of GDP actually fell from 24% to 17% between 2012 and 2018. So here is the foundational structural reason of consumption demand actually sputtering, and that's the third engine of growth which is not doing well. The fourth and final is public expenditure. I think I've already said enough about public expenditure. The government doesn't have the capacity to increase public expenditure because revenues are not rising. In any case, the government reduced corporate tax rates. It reduced the absolute number of personal income tax payers from 60 million to 15 million by raising the threshold at which income tax is levied becomes payable to 5 lakh income per annum. So the absolute number of personal income taxpayers fell from 60 million to 15 million. At the same time, corporate tax rates have been reduced. So the government suffered a loss of about 1 trillion rupees on the corporate tax account. So, revenues are not increasing. Government's capacity to increase for public expenditure is very limited. So, that also the government cannot do. And therefore, all four engines of the economy are sputtering. Now, the result of all of this is when young people are joining the labor force and the government has is not managing to raise growth through any of the four engines, then why should we be surprised that unemployment rates have risen? I mean, and the reason why, the economy in the last analysis, the deeper reason, I'm going further deeper, and these are the sort of structural factors which will all have to be addressed if we are going to get the four engines working. You see, this government, of course, inherited a massive NPA problem, a non-performing assets problem with the banks, which had risen because under the previous government, the banks had been over-lending. And as economy had been slowing down, the corporates had also been unable to finish their projects, and therefore they were not repaying the banks. And so this government inherited what is called the twin balance sheet problem, one on the corporate side, the other on the bank side. But the government also, was the beneficiary of a windfall gain from the dramatic fall in international oil prices. Please remember, India imports about 80% of its oil needs, which and the international price of oil has multifarious effects on the whole economy. It affects inflation because oil is an input into producing so many other things, both directly as well as indirectly, into transportation. Now, oil prices in 13-14 were at the level of $150 per barrel. They fell over the next 1.5 years to $50-60 per barrel. In other words, they fell extremely sharply. Now, when the dollar price is high, then the government tries to maintain the inflation rate by subsidizing petrol and diesel. So, in other words, the domestic price the difference between the domestic price of oil and the international price of oil is accounted for by the amount of subsidy that the government gives. Now, if the international price itself falls, then that's a huge windfall gain to the government because it doesn't have to subsidize. In other words, it has benefits. The government itself is benefiting from it. But unfortunately, the government only used it to enhance welfare measures, build houses, Ujjwala, PM Kisan, and all of that, when in fact it should have actually increased public investment. Had public investment really increased, there was some public investment, but in housing, etc., and somewhat in roads, but I don't think it was enough because it was absolutely critical that when other sort of engines of growth were slowing, then the public investment should have increased when the government had the money. But unfortunately, the demonetization which the government carried out resulted in a further shock to the economy, which was already sort of slowing, and that caused immediate loss over a 1-year period of at least 1 to 1.5% of GDP, and then it reduced demand for an extended period, in small enterprises and unorganized sector enterprises suffered hugely, and demand from rural areas, agriculture also suffered very hugely as a result of that. Because please remember that 14 was a drought year, 2015 was a drought year, but 16 was a good year for monsoon. But when the bumper harvest came, so farmers were already suffering, but the bumper harvest came to the market, the demonetization happened, so food prices, all the crop prices collapsed in the market, and farmers suffered very severely on account of the demonetization. So rural incomes just collapsed. This is one determinant of the low demand. So anyway, just as the economy was coming out of demonetization shock, unfortunately a poorly planned and GST was implemented, and that caused a further shock to the economy. So one outcome was that deeper, the slowdown became deeper. Now, the immediate cause of the further slowing, which was already happening in 17 and became deeper in 18, was the following: that you see, most of us put money back into the banks, and therefore liquidity with the banks had increased enormously, and banks were not being able to lend to companies as for the reasons that I explained, because they were, industry was suffering from low capacity utilization. If existing capacity at 70%, then why would companies invest into new capacity creation? So what the banks started doing in order to get over their crisis, to start lending to NBFCs, non-banking financial companies, and the result of that was the following: that the banks then now overlent to NBFCs, who were further lending to construction companies, to real estate companies. Now, many NBFCs were not in a good financial situation. NBFCs borrowed short and were lending long to real estate developers. Now, because the real estate market was not recovering, the real estate borrowers from the NBFCs were not able to repay NBFCs, and the NBFCs were not able to repay the banks. So the NBFCs started to collapse, the ILFS collapsed, Divan financing collapsed. So you see, on top of the twin balance sheet problem that this government had inherited, we now have 4 balance sheet problem, as Arvind Subramanian says, because which the additional balance sheet problems that exist are in the NBFCs and in the construction and real estate companies. So, in other words, these deeper factors which are determining the cycle of both investment and consumption demand in the economy, these deeper factors will have to be addressed. If they don't get addressed, then the economic slowdown will be quite long drawn out.
So, on one hand, we have economic slowdown. What advice would you give to the common people, for the youth of a nation? Like, what measures should be taken, or what things they should be aware of?
Okay, I think one thing that young people must be very careful about is that they must choose lines of study, because tertiary enrollment has increased very sharply. But young people are learning and entering sort of lines of study which will not get them a job. So they have to look at how the labor market is behaving in certain sectors.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I'm going to give you examples. So modern service sector jobs have been growing quite rapidly. That's the only sector of the economy which has seen growth in jobs. I mean, construction to some extent might see a revival, but construction is not exactly looking like the big growth sector, despite the fact that the government will have to increase over time some infrastructure investment. The modern services are the following: sale, distribution of vehicles, auto vehicles, banking, insurance, pension, financial intermediation, airlines, railways, then IT, telecom. These are all modern services which have been providing jobs in increasing numbers, even though IT had suffered, particularly as the European and the US economic crisis were happening, and also on account of the technological change processes. But yet, IT is still not doing badly at all. Then above all, health and education. We've seen private sector growth in education, private sector growth in health, and where jobs have been growing. So these are the sectors where it will be young people should be focusing, and they must get increasingly better technical skills, and they must acquire soft skills. It's very important because companies are complaining a lot about the absence of soft skills. People don't have communication skills. They don't have English language skills. They don't have good teamworking skills. And so all of these English language skills, all of these are very important to get a reasonable job, in certainly a regular job, and a job in the formal economy. This is on the individual side, but I think there's much action that corporates can take. I think Indian corporates, unfortunately, most of them do not engage in excuse me, in-house enterprise-based training, quite in contrast to Korean companies, Chinese companies, and German companies. In-house enterprise-based training is absolutely critical, and that would enhance the potential for employment for young people. But even more important than that, because after all, young people, when they get that job, only then they will get this enterprise-based training. The other is that corporates themselves must engage with training providers, with secondary schools which are doing vocational education, must engage with NITs, IITs, the engineering institutions, management schools. Industry must engage in a way so that the industry must articulate what are the areas in which they need people, so that young people, when they are taking decisions about what course to take and what to study, they are informed, they are well informed. So in other words, there's need on the part of industry to be more proactive in sharing information about what kinds of needs they themselves have. And they must themselves engage in a much more proactive way in industry. But other than sort of these kinds of actions, I think it's ultimately getting us out of the hole that the economy is in. Has to be the main responsibility of the government. The government has to take this on as a big challenge and get out of denial mode.
I would like to end this note. I would like to keep it brief. Thank you for your time, sir, and thank you, audience, for having a wonderful guest. Thank you, sir.